All right, let me share my screen. And one second. Co-cultural theory. Now, let me make sure everything's in progress. All right, everything's working. All right. When I was younger, I felt a bit like an alien. My parents couldn't understand why, and neither could I. Where did this alienation come from? If I had been informed about co-culture several years earlier from the day, I would not believe that it would have had an effect on my life. However, as I've gotten older, I can now see how this theory and several other concepts relate to my life. My story relates to co-cultural theory, which is a theory covered in our textbook, A First Look at Communication Theory. Hello, I'm Rafi Ali, a student at UALR who is currently studying human services. This speech is meant to discuss co-cultural theory, alienation, and how co-cultural theory has played a part in our current world. I will begin by telling you about my personal experiences and then go on to demonstrate how this relates to the theories I have previously mentioned. But first, I need to mention where this all has started from. It started with a conversation between my mother and everyone has strange interactions with their parents. I had a normal conversation take an odd turn. For context, we were talking to each other, and after I'd gotten very sick. I was sick to the point where I would say really personal things when delirious, and I started talking about my personal experiences. Got to talking, and learned that my mother and I had very different views of ourselves in our childhood. Now, some history and background history of our sort of relationship. My mother and I are close now, but back then I barely spoke about my personal feelings. I thought that they were very embarrassing. My mother didn't talk much about her personal experiences either. She grew up in a different culture than I did back in Pakistan. I was American raised. It surprised me how different we were, and that some of these differences related directly to co-cultural theory. Now, this does raise the question, how much does co-cultural theory play into our daily lives? And how much has it played into my life? And also, what exactly is co-cultural theory? Co-cultural theory is a theory that describes generally smaller groups outside of a dominant culture learning to communicate differently because of their standing. Essentially, there's a dominant culture, and then the cultures around them that are more marginalized and less privileged are referred to as co-cultures. These smaller groups refer to co-cultures. This is named in the textbook A First Look at Communication Theory, Griffin et al., 2023. Now, it's important to understand what this theory is in order to understand how it impacts our world. My mother and I had a very different childhood experiences, partially due to co-culture. I was raised to hide my background, not necessarily the general Asian American co-culture, but also other co-cultures I'm a part of, specifically my religious background. I was born around 9/11 happened in 2001. I was born like a few years afterwards, where resentment against Muslims was at an all-time high. To this day, I still have trouble telling people that I am part of the Muslim co-culture. I also grew up not seeing many people that looked like me, a Pakistani person, and it took me a long time to accept myself. I was a part of the South Asian American co-culture, while my mother was a part of Pakistan's dominant culture. Essentially, Pakistanis were the dominant culture of Pakistan. We came to a better understanding of each other due to the fact that we recognized our differences. I was raised with the expectations to accommodate and hide. She was not, which surprised her. She wasn't aware of the sort of issues I had growing up, which had hurt our relationship sometime in the past. She came to understand a lot of my difficulties, and I learned that our miscommunication wasn't directly from a lack of empathy or not trying to understand, but because we had experienced very different lives. Now, two important theories, Mark Orb and R.J. Rezante. Now, these two are incredibly important, but mainly Mark Orb. Mark Orb is the man who coined the term co-cultural theory in 1996 in his paper, uh, laying the foundation for co-cultural theory. Orb also worked with R.J. Rezante in 2018 on a separate paper researching dominant group theory, which relates directly to co-cultural theory, referred to as two sides of the same coin, where they go more in depth on dominant group theory. Now, there are some concepts to also be understood to better understand this theory as a whole. Phenomenology. Uh, phenomenology. One's incredibly important. It relates to how lived experiences relate with philosophies. For example, interviewing groups of people about their specific lived experiences instead of generalizing an entire group. And looking for a more humanistic and individual approach, this is described in an Intro to Communication Theory. Dominant group theory relates directly to co-cultural theory, described in the piece by Rosante and Orb in 2018. It describes how certain groups are afforded more privileges. Each society has their own separate dominant group. For example, in like homogeneous countries like Korea, more privileges are afforded to ethnic Koreans than other ethnic groups present in that country, which would describe how they're a different dominant group than somewhere like Vietnam. We should look more deeply into phenomenology concerning both people raised as a part of dominant and non-dominant groups. This case is my personal example of phenomenology, my personal experiences and the experiences of my family member. Though my personal experiences relate to phenomenology, you also, listener, have your own experiences that relate to it as well. So please keep those in mind and think of your own as you keep listening. Phenomenology uses experiences of individuals in a three-step process described by Orb in 1996. These steps are lived experiences, themes gathered from said experiences, and self-reflexivity. Lived experiences are the events that happen to them, their specific events. Themes refer to the essential themes of what they learned from said events. And self-reflection is analyzing how this event changed their life, how it had an effect on their worldview, and what their analysis of their own personal values. Now, my own personal experiences involve alienation and issues with self-perception. I do have an issue with the model minority myth, which, described by Daga and Raval in 2018, put towards the co-culture of Asian Americans, certain minorities labeled as model in order to put down other minority groups, which is not beneficial. It's mainly a way for the dominant culture at the time wanted to give an example of what they wanted other co-cultures to look like in order to fit their idea of a model minority. It should be noted that Asian Americans, usually stereotyped together, don't all band together into one co-culture. Typically, they stay with their own ethnic groups, such as Vietnamese to Vietnamese, Korean to Korean, according to Jun et al. 2023. Now, dominant group theory, described by Rosante and Orb in 2018, certain groups, the dominant group, experiences more privilege, and some people and members of these types of groups failed to recognize that they are part of such a group. My mother learned that she was part of the dominant group in Pakistan, where she did not have to experience the alienation or fear of being found out about her background. Now, the textbook An Intro into Communication Theory explains ways to lessen the divide between individuals from dominant cultures and co-cultures. There are several ways to combat issues related to co-cultural theory, and it's good for you to recognize how these practices can be part of your daily life. Now, one thing you can do is recognize different communication approaches. There's typically three types that are usually listed in these sorts of things. Non-assertive, assertive, and aggressive. Non-assertive refers to more accommodating behavior. Assertive refers to behaviors where one stands up for themselves. And aggressive refers to how one stands up to themselves aggressively, very aggressively. Each has their own benefits and their risks. Aggressive is not necessarily recommended due to the fact that it may lead to negative stereotypes of co-cultures. Another positive communication practice is to actually listen to understand the issue, basically focus more on shining knowledge on the issue, and note that co-cultural theory will still occur all over the world. It's not exactly fixable with like a push of a button or lobbying once. And Orb refers to it more as a descriptive rather than prescriptive name co-cultural theory because it describes a happening. And also have a clarification of values instead of pity for people in co-cultures, which is generally condescending. Choose admiration. And if you're part of a co-culture, if you're part of a dominant culture, be respectful to people in co-cultures talking about their experiences instead of forming a savior complex or denying what they're saying. Now, other than learning some positive communication practices, we should round things up. What else can we learn from this? For one thing, we learned that co-cultures members cannot be forced into stereotypes and also be treated differently, afforded less privileges. We also learned that dominant cultures, sometimes like minority myth, put down other minority groups with things like model minority myth, even though all Asians tend to be grouped together, even though they're separate, and how a dominant culture and how a co-culture interact are varies very much based on the situation. But minority, like co-cultural groups, should tend to try to get along with each other and their dominant group in order to develop a better working society. Now, we should also note that cultural positions can change your viewpoints on things. You should analyze your own viewpoints and analyze where you stand on them. Are you part of a dominant culture or a co-culture? And additional questions is, has this theory affected your life or your viewpoints? And are you planning on doing anything differently from now? Uh, and also, generally, what was this whole speech about anyway? I've spoken about my own experiences and I've related them to co-cultural theory and aspects of said theory. I've spoken on what the theory is, how it relates to a dominant group theory, how this relates to my own experiences, and positive communication practices. My mother now understands how her childhood experiences were different. I no longer feel like an alien, but understanding this theory also helped me analyze my own personal experiences and analyze what differences we had in our family. Thank you, and that is it. Let me figure out how to stop the video. One thing.